This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Timothy Knotts, and I discuss books from Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Today is Wednesday, February 26, 2025, and I'm Lee Bortons. And we're being joined today by Emily Martin. She's our academic advisor for challenges A, B, and 1, which means she gets to help not only with the curating and crafting of the assignments, but answer people's questions and make sure that we're listening to our audience. So Emily, I'm glad that you're on. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So, all right, Jennifer, you're the lead. Tell us about this month's shows. And listen, Words Aptly Spoken. Jennifer and I just spent almost 10 days in London, and we heard a lot of really good words spoken by a lot of strong Christians. But it's good to be back, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's been a busy month and it's a short month. So because of our travels, we really just have 2 episodes this month. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we did The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And today we're talking about Where the Red Fern Grows. So we've had books for our, sort of middle learners. And now we're going to shift gears next month and start talking about our oldest learners and look at some of our Challenge 4 resources.
Yeah, and the thing that's so great about both the books this month is that they really are not age related. Anybody can enjoy them. I think it's just really great that they're read alouds for the little ones, as well as they're books I reread as an adult when I don't have anybody to read them to. So that's the thing about good literature is it's good for all ages. So if you want to access any of our past episodes on our podcast, talking about all the great literature that we read here at Classical Conversations, you can go to the YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or also to my website, leebortons.com, in order to catch up with where we've been over the last 3 years and see the archive for the episodes, as well as the calendar of upcoming episodes, and then the link to classicalconversationsbooks.com if you want to purchase the books that we'll be discussing. Okay, thanks, team.
So you know what I'm going to ask you, Lee?
Yeah.
The same question I always ask: why is Where the Red Fern Grows in our Classical Conversations curriculum?
Because I like to make children cry. So that is the number one comment I hear from that book, is that, why'd you make me read that, Mrs. Bortons? It's the saddest ending. But it really isn't. It's a bittersweet ending with a happy projection coming from it forward. And I think they're also crying because they're happy too. But think about it. How many children these days read a book from that's it's kind of like historical fiction. It's not based on a true family, but it's based on real kinds of incidents and lives. But how many people read a book like that from the Ozarks, from the middle of our country? And so geographically, it was just a delightful book to look into another culture and how children came of age.
Yeah, I appreciate that about this book, since I am from closer to that part of the country. And this is a good one for what you said at the beginning of our call, which is you can read this book at all ages and you will cry, but you will also laugh because Wilson Ross has a good sense of humor. And one year with our children that were going into Challenge A, we read his other book, Summer of the Monkeys, just so that they could have another exposure to him. And that book is hilariously funny. So if you need to balance, you can have one that makes, tugs on your heartstrings and one that makes you laugh out loud. And they're just great to read with your family. And in fact, since I have been doing this job, my dad has gone back and read both of Wilson Rawls' major books. And he enjoyed them just as much. So
did he have any unusual comments thinking about his age and experience?
I think more than that, it was a nice mix of nostalgia for him, because although he wasn't quite in the age group of the main character in the books, he was close enough to have those memories. And he did have a rural growing up through his grandparents' farm. And so it just felt familiar to him. And I think that's one thing our CC families appreciate, is just having a story about a really tight family with multiple generations who are there to advise and pick you up when you make mistakes, and that the younger generation is taking care of one another. It's a good model for homeschooling families. So, all right. Well, it is not actually a true story, but it feels like one. And I actually really like that kind of book. So, Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about the author and how he pulled this story together?
Sure. Wilson Rawls, like you said, pretty much known for two books, this one and Summer of the Monkeys. My family just read Summer of the Monkeys this year, or last year, late last year. And yes, a rollicking good time to be had in that book. Um, but Rawls was born back in the 1910s and outside the Ozarks, in Oklahoma, in a town called Scraper, Oklahoma. Sounds appropriate, near the colorfully named Pumpkin Hollow. So uh, clearly he's intimately familiar with both the geography of what he's writing about and the kind of people who live in those places. You know, it's so believable because clearly he modeled some of these folks on people he knew growing up. Grew up in, you know, grew up with no extensive formal education, so he was pretty much homeschooled. His mom taught him reading and writing and read good books to him. And during the Great Depression, he went off to find jobs where he could find them and traveled all over North America and South America doing carpentry jobs, and only started writing a little later in life, not too old, 45, 46 years old, he started writing books. And um, so anyway, yeah, like we said, it's a novel. It's not a true story, but you can tell when people are writing stories that come from places of experience and not just fanciful ideas. And this is that sort of story that that feels real because it's more of a translation of real things than it is an invention of a new thing.
Yeah, that's a really good description.
Yeah.
He definitely knows the geography and the animals well.
I like how you said translation. I'm gonna think about that.
Yeah. I think that's an apt phrase. Speaking of words aptly spoken. Good job. Um, well, Emily, as you know, that in challenge A and B particularly, we do read a lot of children's literature, and we've talked about this here on our book club before, that is really coming of age literature, where they are starting to transition out of childhood and into adulthood. And so not only do we have a good set of books to help them with that, but we also have our challenge themes about ownership and discipline. So what kind of conversations do you see this book families having around it or communities having around it, and how does that help them with those wrestlings?
Yeah, so I think the most popular conversation that is prompted, from reading this is they're really shocked about how long Billy had to work to earn money for his dogs, and how little he made like per day. He had to save up for 2 years to earn $50. And so they were just flabbergasted by that concept of, oh my goodness, he had to work for so long. Um, and that kind of leads naturally to a conversation about inflation. So you move into a little bit of economics during that conversation. What it did in my personal family, with my son, when he read this book, it prompted him to want to earn money. He wanted to build his own computer. And so he decided, okay, well, I'm going to work hard and earn my money to save up, it's several $100s so he could build his computer. And I just know he would have never done that had he not read this book. And even in the Challenge B curriculum, they read before this Little Britches by Ralph Moody, which is another really great book about strong work ethic in this age group of kids, 12, 13 years old. And also brings up a conversation about loyalty. I think there's a lot of loyalty in this book, whether it's Billy to his dogs, dogs to Billy, the family to one another, the grandfather. It's a wonderful story about just that close knit family. And so you see a lot of that conversation come out, with the students.
Yeah, I really like what you highlighted. I think those are two things I saw in my own family too, that ownership comes about when we talk about working for the things we want. And then it also comes about in caring for animals and having them care for you. That seems to be one of the relationships that this age group practices that idea of ownership with, is their animals. So
I think too, it's such a nice bridge idea between the themes, the challenge themes of challenge A ownership and this discipline, and then leading to freedom, that you see it worked out in Billy, right? That he takes responsibility and he exercises discipline and thereby gains freedom to go do these things that he wants to do. But the freedom doesn't free him from the responsibilities. It's a freedom to complete his obligations, and to do it independently.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. We talk about in challenge 3, with, much older kids, that idea that, freedom doesn't mean license to do whatever you want. In the minds of the founding fathers, it was freedom to make the best choices. And I think both of his books are a good example of that, where the young person is free to do what they want with their money and their possessions, but they learn that the best freedom is making virtuous choices for their family and their community. And so those are good examples.
I think
Yeah,
of
and
some,
I think that kind of
oh, go ahead, Emily.
yeah, I think that kind of goes up into another conversation that comes up is about peer pressure. Billy made a decision and he ended up putting himself in a bad situation where ego was involved a little bit, and and ultimately led to a teenager passing away. And so as that conversation comes up with, yeah, you have the freedom, but make the good decisions. You have the choices, but think it through. And that comes up, I think, in some of the conversations I've seen with students.
Your two comments about, Jennifer, about your children and their pets, and then Emily with your son, working to make money for something that he wanted. It reminded me of the proper use of the word passion. It's almost like a subtitle of the book could be The Passion of Billy, because passion actually means to suffer. And he was willing to suffer much to get these dogs. And then once he got them, he suffered much because he had the dogs. And, that word passion is not always about positive things. It can be about negative things, but I think the intention of the word in the Latin form is it's a suffering that leads to better things. And the story is just so well told about just the angst that a 12, 13-year-old boy can go through. And what I always find interesting is people would always tell me like how emotional girls are. And I mean, I know that they are, but with the 4 boys I had, they were pretty emotional too. And so, books like Little Britches and Where the Red Fern Grows reminds us that sometimes our culture is not correct about how boys respond to things.
Yes. In fact, one year I was going to host a movie night for this after the kids read the book. And one of the young men's mothers called me and said, he cannot come tonight because this movie makes him cry and he doesn't want to cry in front of his friends. And I just thought, well, I think it'll be okay. But he didn't come. He just did not. Yeah, he just couldn't handle that experience. But I think your point about passion is good, and maybe hits on too why this story is timeless for all ages, because we have the peer pressure that you mentioned, Emily, which is very timely for the young people in the room, and it's good for them to experience that serious consequence of someone dying as a result of your actions without having that experience in real life.
Right.
It's good for them to see him go through that. And then on the other end, we can think about ourselves as parents, that idea of passion and both the joy and the suffering that are part of parenthood. And so we can see that through his relationship with his dogs. So that makes it very timeless. Well, as we have hinted around about, there are some challenging themes and some hard events in this book. So we've got this curious situation where we have a book that really is directed at younger readers, but there is grief and loss. And as Emily mentioned, the death of another boy. So what do you guys think about that? How does that help us as parents as we're reading these things with our kiddos?
Well, I think you touched on it. It's being able for the children to experience something without them having to actually experience it. They can read about it and you can have that conversation with your child. But if they haven't lost a loved one, maybe they can't fully comprehend some of these bigger concepts of death and passing away. And so this kind of gives you a concrete thing to talk about. Say, hey, these are some of the things that happen in life. So I think it's a great segue into having the hard conversations that we all have to have as a parent, when in the shelter and within the bounds of home and family.
I think something that's maybe sad about our life now that this book highlights without meaning to is so few children spend enough time with their grandparents, like they don't live with them like they used to, that it can often feel like just another old person passing away, and I don't really understand who they are or where they went, versus the closeness this family experienced. Because I want to say this book could help children get ready for when their own older relatives pass on. But I don't know that they make that connection anymore. What do you think?
I think it's not just grandparents, and our modern American culture is we've sanitized everything so much for kids, right? We don't most of us don't live on farms. We don't have animals that we slaughter. We don't go out and hunt and kill things. We go to the grocery store and pick up the packet of chicken, um, right? That's already disassembled for us and cleaned up. And uh, death is big and scary, but it's also always very far away. It's like for our kids, even for most of us, until our parents or our siblings start dying, we don't have an intimate relationship with everyday death. And um, this book is hard because you feel very attached to the grief that Billy feels, but also even to the dogs, right? That there's that relationship that um, is a hard loss because you get emotionally attached, where we don't get emotionally attached to things like that in our real lives very often. Um, so it is good, and it's out of time, but it's also should be timeless.
Right. And really, since we're talking about words aptly spoken and books and their place in our lives, the point of stories has always been understood to be helping us make sense of those situations, right? All the way back to Aristotle, when he talks about tragedy being cathartic, we need to grieve as humans, and we are told to grieve with others who grieve. That's one of Jesus's points in the Sermon on the Mount, right? We need to mourn with those who mourn, and these stories help to prepare us and carry us through those experiences. It is an important part of being human, and too often nowadays, I say this quite often, but I was in a family very close to my grandparents, and my grandparents grew up having very hard circumstances. And so one of the things that never happened for them is that they never thought they had so much control over what happened in their lives. We sort of live in this fallacy bubble of hard things. We can prevent hard things from happening to ourselves and our children because we have so much more control over our circumstances nowadays. And ultimately, that's actually very bad for us because then when those things do happen, those hard things happen, we don't have a way, we haven't practiced and prepared ourselves. Yeah. So,
Because I don't think any of us want grandparents to die early or siblings to die, or we're so happy that babies no longer just naturally die, because childbirth is so difficult. So we don't really want that kind of closeness in our families' lives. But these books help them to prepare when it does happen, because it will happen eventually. I did think of something I want to share that will sound funny, but it wasn't. So the boys and I were living out of country, and we actually were in the middle of devotions and got a phone call, and I answered it, and they didn't know who it was from, and they could tell by the look on my face that I was stricken, and my eyes were watering, and I said something about, well, where did he die? And then they started crying. And then I got off the phone as quick as I could, and this is when they were like 18, 19-year-olds. And I got off the phone and they said, who died? And I said, the ranger, our poor dog, your dad hit it with the car and the ranger's dead. And then they started crying harder. And I was like, okay, what's going on? It was just an unusual amount of emotion. And they said, when you got the call, we thought dad had died. We're so glad it was the dog, not dad. Right. So that was just, it was such a strong 5 minutes of emotion, and to watch these, big bulky boys just crying and crying, because then when they realized that they weren't happy the dog was dead either. So just dealing with that was similar to what you read in this book.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's good for us in community to be vulnerable with our emotions. So I always tell when I'm directing challenge 2, I always tell them when we read Something Beautiful for God, okay, I cannot read this book out loud to you without crying. So I'm warning you now. Feel free to join in with me if you'd like to cry with me. If not, there's no reason to be embarrassed because it's okay for us to be moved by these stories. And so I think that's good for us all to learn how to do that together. So
Yeah, and we learn a lot of lessons from stories. I mean, even Jesus told stories to teach lessons and to get points across, in his parables. So this is something that's, like you said, it's been going back thousands of years of using stories to teach our children.
yeah, absolutely. To help us make sense of things. Well, I think shockingly, it is already time for our break, Lee. So I'll let you take it over for a minute.
So we want to thank once again classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. And we have the entire 2023 through 2025 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to Classical Conversation book site. And you also can listen to past episodes at Lee Bortons. Feels funny saying my name so many times, but it's very easy to find it if you use my name. Anyway, so next week we're going to be talking about The Discoverers by Daniel Boorstin, one of those original books in classical conversations. And it just makes me happy to know we're going to talk about it. It's a history resource that topically explores the inventions and discoveries that shaped the world. And it just gives our students an opportunity to think, somebody did that? So it's a great book to talk about. All right, are we ready to look at our passages?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this will be quite a gear. I was just thinking as you were talking, this will be quite an emotional and mental shift for us all to go from Where the Red Fern Grows to The Discoverers next week. But I have confidence that we'll make the shift. All right. So we've already given away the fact that the main human character of the book is Billy, and most of the action takes place when he's a boy. But the book starts off with him as an adult. And it's the incident is that he's just witnessed a dog fight and he has intervened to help this older hound dog. And this tugs at his heartstrings and revives these old memories so that it moves us back in time to his boyhood. So Lee, do you want to read the first one for us?
Be happy to do that. I had to get it big enough to read it. Okay, as I turned the collar with my finger, I saw something else. There, scratched deep in the tough leather, was the name Buddy. I guessed that the crude, scribbly letters had probably been written by a little boy. It's strange indeed how memories can be dormant in a man's mind for so many years, yet those memories can be awakened and brought forth fresh and new just by something you've seen, or something you've heard, or the sight of an old familiar face. What I saw in the warm gray eyes of the friendly old hound brought back wonderful memories. To show my gratitude, I took hold of his collar and I said, "Come on, boy, let's go home and get something to eat." He seemed to understand that he'd found a friend. He came willingly. I gave him a bath and rubbed all the soreness from his muscles. He drank quarts of warm milk and ate all the meat I had in the house. I hurried down to the store and bought more. He ate until he was satisfied. He slept all that night and most the next day, and late in the afternoon he grew restless. I told him I understood, and as soon as it was dark, he could be on his way. I figured he'd had a much better chance if he left town at night. That evening, a little after sundown, I opened the back gate. He walked out, stopped, turned around, and looked at me. He thanked me by wagging his tail. With tears in my eyes, I said, "You're more than welcome, old fellow. In fact, you could have stayed here as long as you wanted to." He whined and licked my hand. I was wondering which way he would go. With one final whimper, he turned and headed east. I couldn't help smiling as I watched him trot down the alley. I noticed the way his hindquarters shifted over to the right, never in line with the front, yet always in perfect rhythm. His long ears flopped up and down, keeping time with the jogging motion of his body. Yes, they were all there, the unmistakable marks of a hunting hound. Where the alley emptied into the street, he stopped and looked back. I waved my hand. As I watched him disappear in the twilight shadows, I whispered these words, "Goodbye, old fella. Good luck and good hunting." I didn't have to let him go. I could have kept him in my backyard, but to pen up a dog like that is a sin. It would have broken his heart. The will to live would have slowly left his body. I had no idea where he had come from or where he was going. And perhaps it wasn't too far, or maybe it was a long, long way. I tried to make myself believe that his home was in the Ozark Mountains, somewhere in Missouri or Oklahoma. It wasn't impossible, even though it was a long way from the Snake River Valley in Idaho. I figured something drastic must have happened in his life, as it's very unusual for a hound to be traveling all alone. Perhaps he'd been stolen, or maybe he'd been sold for some much needed money. Whatever it was that had interrupted his life, he was trying to straighten it out. He was going home to the master he loved, and with the help of God, he would make it.
Such lovely writing. I was thinking Lee and I had a chance to meet one of our favorite authors last week when we were traveling. And one thing he said really struck me is that he returned to certain books over and over again, the older he gets, just for the sake of the lovely writing. And as you were reading this passage, I was thinking, there's nothing really complicated about the way Rawls has written this scene, but he's such a master of this simple, homely moment that you can see him taking care of the dog, and you can see the way the dog walks and the way his ears flop, and it's just such a beautiful writing.
In challenge 1, the students have to quote a passage or something, they have to memorize something for 3 to 5 minutes. And 2 of my students in challenge 1 chose Where the Red Fern Grows as their passage to memorize. And it was at the end of the book, and we were all crying by that point. But yeah, it was just so beautiful. Just to hear the words, it was, yeah, really lovely writing.
Yeah, I love that he knows he's learned something about dogs, and particularly hunting dogs. And even though he has a desire, like he would love to have this dog stay with him, obviously, like that's his personal desire, he also knows that there's something about the nature of the dog that would be bad for the dog. It would not be a good thing. And so he prefers the dog, right? He overcomes his own desire, knowing that it's not the right thing, even if it's the wanted thing. And that's wisdom, right? And that's love of something other than self. I think it's a beautiful picture.
Yeah, I was struck in that part, Sim, by the fact that Rawls's words are not just, this would have been a bad decision, but to pin up a dog like that is a sin. And then I heard that echo of our challenge 1 book, To Kill a Mockingbird, where Atticus says to kill a mockingbird is a sin. Right. So there's this a thing that I appreciate in a lot of our books that so in a classical education, a lot of people talk about virtue and they somehow become these abstract things. Somehow reframing this as a sin really makes the consequences of the action high, and the sacrifice of his choice is framed differently just because of that little word. To pin up a dog like that is a sin. Did you have a thought, Lee? I know you were reading.
Yeah, it's hard to read and think at the same time, but this is what I was thinking while I was reading it. That his writing style is not only beautiful, the sentences are structured in such a way they're easy to read aloud. He gives you places to pause, there's commas and there's conjunctions on his longer sentences. And so it allows you to just, I think, read it in a way where you can engage younger minds that are pre-readers.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, this is in my own life. This is one that a beloved teacher read aloud to us in like maybe 3rd grade. We were young, I remember. So. All right. So I think Emily already alluded to the first major conflict in the book, and that is the fact that Billy is in desperate want of a pair of hunting dogs all of his own, and it's going to cost this monstrous sum of $50. And his family is poor. That's one thing about both of his stories, that a lot of the sacrificial choices they have to make come from their circumstances. Because if you live in the Ozarks in the 1910s through 30s, you're probably not going to be super wealthy. And so he saves up for 2 whole years So I can't imagine any of our young people waiting that long for anything. That's a long time. He gets the dogs, he goes into town to pick them up, and has this other weird experience that shows up in some of our literature where he lives out in the country and now he's in the town, and they live very differently from him. So Tim, do you want to read us that one?
Yes, there's a little bit of country mouse, city mouse going on in
Yes.
this part. Um, Leaving the main part of town, I started up a long street through the residential section. I had never seen so many beautiful houses, and they were all different colors. The lawns were neat and clean, and I looked like green carpets. I saw a man pushing some kind of a mowing machine. I stopped to watch the whirling blades. He gawked at me. I hurried on. I heard a lot of shouting and laughing ahead of me. Not wanting to miss anything, I walked a little faster. I saw what was making the noise. More kids than I had ever seen were playing around a big red brick building. I thought some rich man lived there and was giving a party for his children. Walking up to the edge of the playground, I stopped to watch. The boys and girls were about my age and were as thick as flies around a sorghum mill. They were milling, running, and jumping. Teeter-totters and swings were loaded down with them. Everyone was laughing and having a big time. Over against the building, a large blue pipe ran up on an angle from the ground. A few feet from the top, there was a bend in it. The pipe seemed to go into the building. Boys were crawling into its dark mouth. I counted 9 of them. One boy stood about 6 feet from the opening with a stick in his hand. Staring goggle-eyed, trying to figure out what they were doing, I got a surprise. Out of the hollow pipe spurted a boy. He sailed through the air and lit on his feet. The boy with the stick marked the ground where he landed. All 9 of them came shooting out, one behind the other. As each boy landed, a new mark was scratched. They ganged around looking at the lines. There was a lot of loud talking, pointing, and arguing. Then all the lines were erased and a new scorekeeper was picked out. The others crawled back into the pipe. I figured out how the game was played. After climbing to the top of the slide, the boys turned around and sat down. One at a time, they came flying down and out feet first. The one that shot out the furthest was the winner. I thought how wonderful it would be if I could slide down just one time. One boy, spying me standing on the corner, came over. Looking me up and down, he asked, "Do you go to school here?" I said, "School?" He said, "Sure, school. What do you think it was?" "Oh, no, I don't go to school here." "Do you go to Jefferson?" "No, I don't go there either." "Don't you go to school at all?" "Sure, I go to school." "Where?" "At home." "You go to school at home?" I nodded. "What grade are you in?" I said I wasn't in any grade. Puzzled, he said, "You go to school at home and you don't know what grade you're in? Who teaches you?" "My mother." "What does she teach you?" I said, "Reading, writing, and arithmetic." "I bet I'm just as good at it as you are." He asked, "Don't you have any shoes?" I said, "Sure, I have shoes." "Why aren't you wearing them?" "I don't wear shoes until it gets cold." He laughed and asked where I lived. I said, "Back in the hills." He said, "Oh, you're a hillbilly." He ran back to the mob. I saw him pointing at me and talking to several boys. They started my way, yelling, "Hillbilly, hillbilly!" Just before they reached me, a bell started ringing. Turning, they ran to the front of the building, lined up in 2 long lines, and marching like little tin soldiers, disappeared inside the school. The playground was silent. I was all alone and felt lonely and sad.
Mm, It's a great scene. Now I've lost. Oh, yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about Rawls is that he's really good at similes and metaphors, and it's so easy to write bad ones. I mean, it really is easy to write bad ones. And I love when he says the boys and girls were about my age and they were as thick as flies around a sorghum mill. That's
Mhm.
a great simile.
It's very Mark Twain-like.
Mhm.
I like the
Yeah.
exchange about school. I mean, I feel like we have that conversation a lot as homeschoolers. And people saying, "Oh, where do you go to school?" "Oh, I don't go to school," or it just that feels real to me in my life with my children when they have conversations with adults.
Yeah. Again, I think that's very autobiographical because that was
Yeah.
Rawls. He didn't
Yeah.
go to school much. He got most of his schooling at home, so he
Mhm.
probably had that conversation a lot of times.
Yeah.
I like his confidence that his mom is just as good as their teachers.
Mhm.
Jesus taught him well.
There's also that mob mentality. of the schoolboys who are getting ready to do something before the bell rings. And he's literally saved by the bell here from what was probably going to be a beating. And that's true too. I mean, I think a lot of our kids, when they get around a bunch of kids who are in public school, there's the us versus them thing that just automatically gets set up, and it can be a real challenge.
Yeah.
So I was gonna make that same comment, Tim, and then I started thinking about other parts of the book, and there's bullies in the woods also who don't know anybody. Like, sin's just sin, isn't it? It just seems to get worse when you're in a congregation.
That's true. And when you don't understand the differences and with the people that are in front of you, it's just, there's just that desire to say us versus them.
I also like how he ends with I was alone and felt lonely and sad, that he didn't know that he was missing out till he saw what he was missing out on. And, you know, that's what happens to me too, to everybody. Like, you know, we can't help but they even have a word for it, right? FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
And so he's experiencing a little bit of this because he wants to, and I know why he picked this section, or why Stephanie did, one of our other hostesses, is because of the game they were playing and how often we talk about, you know, children love making up games. And we've taken away that responsibility and the consequence by always making things organized into T-ball at the rec center, instead of just letting them play with a blue pipe and using chalk to keep score.
Yeah, I was having a memory of one of the times that the Summer Olympics were on when my kids were just old enough, probably they and the neighbor kids were probably 7 to 10, and they made up their own Olympics, and they had clipboards out in the yard to keep score. And, you know, they had to settle the fights of what the scores were, and it was fun to watch them. So.
Yeah, I'm just the other night picked up my kids from youth group and they were playing Foursquare, and there was no adult supervising that game, and it was constant bickering over whether it was on the line or out of bounds or someone had touched it twice. And this social requirement that they work it out between them, you know, was at work, but it was noisy and loud and chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to resist the urge to step in. All right.
Oh,
we would be. Oh, go ahead, Lee.
I was saying, adults today can't not step in between helmets and rules, and I don't know, it's just so many things. So I just, again, love this book for our children to read so they can say, oh, there was a time period when boys could just take their dog and go hunting overnight, and mom and dad thought that was normal.
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, all right. Well, we would be remiss if we did not talk about the dogs. So I set us up at the beginning saying the main human character is Billy, but we have, besides the old hound dog, we do have Billy's beloved hunting dogs, Old Dan and Little Ann. And I love that because their names are also similar. Simple. We've been talking about this is just homely. It's just Old Dan and Little Ann. And they have many successful hunts, but there are a couple of instances that give us some opportunity to practice comparison. And so one is when the dogs chase a coon up into a tree that Billy actually is chopping it down to reach the prize. And he gets a little bit frustrated. And the other is when Billy and his dogs tree the elusive ghost coon. Which sounds like a great legend, in order to win a bet, but they let the coon go. So that may sound familiar to our hound dog incident too. So Emily, do you want to be our reader this time?
I sure will. Okay. The first half hour was torture. At each swing of the axe, my arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. I gritted my teeth and kept hacking away. My body felt like it did the time my sister rolled me down the hill in a barrel. As Papa had said, in a little while, the warm heat from the hard work limbered me up. I remembered what my father did when he was swinging an axe. At the completion of each swing, he always said, ha! I tried it. Karam, ha! Karam, ha! I don't know if it helped or not, but I was willing to try anything if it would hurry the job. Several times before noon, I had to stop and rake my chips out of the way. I noticed that they weren't even big, even solid chips like my father had made when he was chopping. They were small and seemed to crumple up and come all to pieces. Neither were the cuts neat and even. They were ragged and looked more like the work of beavers. But I wasn't interested in any beautiful tree chopping. All I wanted was to hear the big sycamore start popping. Along in the middle of the afternoon, I felt a stinging in one of my hands. When I saw it was a blister, I almost cried. At first, there was only one, then two. After another, they rose up all on my hands like small white marbles. They filled up and turned a pale pinkish color. When one would burst, it was all I could do to keep from screaming. I tore my handkerchief in half and wrapped my hands. This helped for a while, but when the cloth began to stick to the raw flesh, I knew it was the end. Crying my heart out, I called my dogs to me and showed them my hands. I can't do it, I said. I've tried, but I just can't cut it down. I can't hold the axe any longer. Little Ann whined and started licking my sore hands. Old Dan seemed to understand. He showed his sympathy by nuzzling me with his head. Broken-hearted, I started for home. As I turned from the corner of my eye, I saw Grandpa's scarecrow. It seemed to be laughing at me. I looked over to the big sycamore. It lacked so little being cut down. A small wedge of solid wood was all that was holding it up. I let my eyes follow the smooth white trunk up to the huge spreading limbs. Sobbing, I said, "You think you have won, but you haven't. Although I can't get the coon, neither can you live because I've cut your breath of life." And then I thought, why kill the big tree and not accomplish anything? I began to feel bad. Kneeling down between my dogs, I cried and prayed, "Please, God, give me the strength to finish the job. I don't want to leave the big tree like that. Please help me finish the job." I was trying to rewrap my hands so I could go back to work when I heard a low droning sound. I stood up and looked around. I could still hear the noise, but couldn't locate it. I looked up. High in the top of the sycamore, a breeze had started the limbs to sway. A shudder ran through the huge trunk. I knew it was going to fall. Grabbing my dogs by their collars, I backed off to safety. And then chapter 13, I looked at Rainey, laughing. I said, "There's your ghost coon. Now what do you think of my dogs?" For once, he made no reply. Going over to the post, I saw it was a large black locust put there many years ago to hang the gate. Looking at the tree, I saw how the ghost coon had pulled his trick. One large, long limb ran out and hung directly over the gate. It was a drop of a good 12 feet from the branch to the top of the gatepost, but I knew we weren't after any ordinary coon. This was the ghost coon. For a split second, the ghost coon stayed on top of the post and then he jumped. My dogs were on him the instant he hit the ground. The fight was on. I knew the coon didn't have a chance as he wasn't in the waters of the river. He didn't give up easily, even though he was on dry land. He was fighting for his life, and a good account he gave. He fought his way to freedom and made it back to the bur oak tree. He was a good 6 feet up the side when old Dan, leaping high in the air, caught him and pulled him back down. At the foot of the tree, the fight went on. Again, the ghost coon fought his way free. This time, he made it and disappeared in the dark shadows of the tree. Old Dan was furious. Never before had I seen a coon get away from him. I told Reuben I would climb up and run him out. As I started climbing, I saw little Ann go to one side and old Dan to the other. My dogs would never stay together when they had treed a coon, so that any way he left a tree, he was met by one of them. About halfway up, far out on a limb, I found the ghost coon. As I started toward him, my dogs stopped bawling. I heard something I had heard many times. The sound was like the cry of a small baby. It was the cry of a ringtail coon when he knows it is the end of the trail. I never liked to hear this cry, but it was all in the game, the hunter and the hunted. As I sat there on the limb looking at the old fella, he cried again. Something came over me. I didn't want to kill him. I hollered down and told Reuben I didn't want to kill the ghost coon. He hollered back, "Are you crazy?" I told him I wasn't crazy. I just didn't want to kill him. I climbed down. Reuben was mad. He said, "What's the matter with you?" "Nothing," I told him. "I just don't have the heart to kill the coon." I told him there were plenty more. Why kill him? He had lived there a long time, and more than one hunter had listened to the voices of his hounds bawling on his trail.
I love in that first story, I think it's a good illustration of what we talked about with this extended family that he's part of. So first he's upset because he doesn't cut the tree as well as his dad does. So we've already established that he sees maturity as growing up to be like his dad, and he aspires to be skillful like his dad. That in itself is a precious moment. And then when he starts to give up, what keeps him going is something he sees in grandpa's field. And so he's got these multiple generations, even though the two men are not there, they are there spurring him on to manhood. And that's a pretty precious part of that scene.
Good.
And in the first scene, what's really driving him is it's the first hunt with his dogs, and letting the coon win means teaching something to his dogs that he doesn't want them to learn. And so while he's under his father and his grandfather's influence, he's also looking at those who are looking up to him, right? He has this maturity about him to know that it's not just about what he wants, it's about what his dogs need from him. And so there's that responsibility that he feels for them in their training.
So I have a question for you, Emily. When you talk about that second scene in Community, do the kids agree that he should let the ghost coon go free, or do they argue about this?
I think it probably depends on the kid you ask. Yeah, I think many of them felt like he should have gone free. I think, we're talking about that relationship between, people and animals. And I think many of them feel like, oh no, I think the ghost coon needs to go free. They agree with Billy. It's been there a long time. That's his terrain. Just let him go.
Well, Billy's proven to be a worthy adversary and has done what he needed to conquer. And he's wise enough to know that's enough.
Mhm.
Yeah. And you can tell by that story too, that he sees himself as part of the groups of hunters, right? He no longer sees himself as a young and experienced boy. As he says, many hunters have heard him, and he clearly puts himself in that group now. I'm one of the seasoned hunters.
Yeah, and he doesn't hunt to kill just to kill, right? I mean, there's a game to it, and he knows that it's part of it that usually the hunted animal dies, but he's exerted that mastery, and so there's a win in it even without completing the act. And he's wise enough to see that, to know that it's not always about going all the way. You can still win stopping short.
Also a life lesson that I think escapes modernity. Why even go after raccoons? Sure, you can get a coonskin cap, and they probably needed some small furs for various things because they don't have a Walmart. But this young man's also learning how to deal with his dog so that when he needs to go after bear or deer or bigger game, he's learning how to just hunt. And I'm sure there was lots of raccoons. There's plenty of them. It's like chasing after squirrels. And he can practice any season. It's not necessarily depleting the harvest of the forest by going after the raccoons.
Well, we're actually out of time, but I'll let you finally close this out, Lee, but I do hope that we have inspired some of our listeners to read this book and just enjoy it as a family.
Yeah, so I just really thank the three of you for joining me doing this. And Emily, welcome and come back again. I thought you had a lot of insight. And I just really appreciate our listeners and look forward to sharing our love for the discoverers and facts from history with you next week. So see you guys later. Bye.
Hey guys.
Thank you.